Okay, and now it's my really great pleasure to introduce my friend, my author, my colleague, Ricky Robertson. Ricky is an educator and a consultant. He's worked with students from pre-K through 12th grade, many of whom have faced adversity and trauma. He began his career in education as a New York City public high school teacher, and he then went on to work as a behavior specialist and as an administrator in both traditional and alternative schools, supporting students with significant mental health and behavioral needs. Ricky currently works with state and federal policymakers as an advisor on trauma-informed care in both public health and education policy. I am thrilled to introduce him to you, and I'll hand it over to you, Ricky.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited for our conversation this afternoon or evening, depending on which part of the country or world you're joining from. I want to talk a little bit about sort of how we got here to have a conversation around psychological safety and how I came about writing the book, The Other Teachers, which is the first book to explore the topic of psychological safety among K-12 teachers. So some of you might know me as an education consultant and coach. I work with schools, school districts, state departments of education on developing trauma-informed multi-tiered systems of support to address the mental health and behavioral needs of students. And that's all students, but especially those impacted by adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and trauma. And so how do I go about doing this work that's very much focused around systems and MTSS to writing a book about psychological safety? And part of it actually was because I was at a school and I had just finished facilitating a professional development session for the staff about educator well-being and self-regulation and responding to students' behavioral needs. And I had finished this session and I was walking to my car at the end of the day. And a teacher approached me in the parking lot and she was very serious and she asked if we could talk. And she said, Ricky, the hardest thing for me about teaching is not the students, it's the other teachers. And she went on to describe a lot of incredibly painful experiences of being belittled, harassed, gossiped about, excluded, and bullied by her administrator and many staff members in the school. And parts of her story are included in the first chapter of The Other Teachers, although there's actually some parts of her story that were intentionally left out because we agreed that out of concern for her safety and also her seeking legal recourse to represent herself and address some of these issues, it was best that they not be included in the book. But that conversation, which I had about, I guess it was around April of 2021, so about 3.5 years ago, sort of changed the course of my life because I then spent the next 2.5 years interviewing teachers, schools, counselors, school psychologists, administrators, paraprofessionals, but primarily classroom teachers about their experiences of psychological safety, including both positive experiences of feeling like part of a team and feeling supported and valued, but also very difficult and painful experiences of working in toxic workplace cultures that were rife with fear-based leadership and workplace bullying behaviors. So across those 2.5 years of writing The Other Teachers, I interviewed a variety of educators and across K-12 in suburban, urban, and rural communities across the socioeconomic spectrum from a variety of different ethnic and cultural identities, and also from a variety of different schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools. And I also read books and articles and studies on the topic of psychological safety. Because what happened was when I talked to her in that parking lot that day, what she was describing, while incredibly challenging and difficult, was not completely unfamiliar to me. It was something I had noticed in a lot of different schools. I would go in to do work around systems and their behavioral MTSS, and I would notice that some teams were able to come together, support one another, have tough conversations, make decisions, do hard things, but ultimately see an improvement in student outcomes. And other times I would go to work with schools and the leadership team or certain grade level teams the work would get overwhelmed and consumed with blame, with cynicism, with infighting, with little informal pecking orders where people were putting each other down during meetings. And the work would go nowhere, but largely because of the interpersonal dynamics among the teams. And so I was sort of thinking about what she had said to me that day in that parking lot, but also what I had noticed in my own work. And I started to look for like what is the concept? What is the sort of name to describe the water we're swimming in when it comes to these unseen influences that have a big impact on our collective efficacy and our ability to both do our jobs, enjoy our work, but also make an impact. And that's when I heard about a study called the Aristotle Project. And the Aristotle Project was a study conducted by Google, the company, the search engine that practically runs the world. Um, but Google did a study within its own company back between 2012 and 2015 to try to figure out what causes teams to be successful. And so for multiple years, Google conducted this huge study that looked at over 250 different influences on team effectiveness across 180 different teams within their company. And what they discovered surprised them because they went into the study with a hypothesis, which is it's all about the expertise. It's all about who's on the team. But what they discovered was that that wasn't true. What determined a team's effectiveness was how the individuals on that team treated one another. And so out of the 250 different influences on team effectiveness that were explored during the Aristotle Project, psychological safety turned out to be the number one influence on a team's success and effectiveness. So let's talk a little bit about what psychological safety is. So Amy Edmondson, who's a researcher, a scholar, a wonderful thought leader who I highly recommend. I've read her books, I've watched her TED Talk, I've watched a variety of her talks that are on YouTube. She defines psychological safety, and she was also instrumental in shaping the Aristotle Project, the study that Google conducted. She defines psychological safety as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. Now, psychological safety is not the same as just being nice. In fact, actually, I know several schools that are nice, that value niceness above all else. And by niceness, I don't mean kindness. I mean superficial, conflict avoidant, keep a smile on your face, and avoid any tough conversations, right, that are connected to reality, avoid accountability, avoid conflict, etc. Nice schools, quote unquote, that value that superficiality can actually be very psychologically unsafe places to work in. They can have a lot of gossip, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of scapegoating, a lot of excessive criticism and cliques, right? So when we talk about psychological safety, it's not being nice. It's actually something that has to be cultivated and sustained intentionally through leadership, through structured collaboration and inquiry, and through authentic and respectful communication. And there's different stages to psychological safety, which is one of the things that we unpack in the other teachers. And I'm going to talk just briefly, because we just have 45 minutes, an hour together, about those stages of psychological safety and also some of the ways that those stages are achieved and maintained within schools. But it is something a little bit more complex and intentional than just simply being nice to one another. It's something that we actually cultivate and model as individuals, collectively within our teams, as well as school-wide, and as leaders and administrators. And the good news is that I actually know schools, and I say that, and I say good news, but I say this because the psychological safety of a school is not solely defined by the principal or the administrator. It's something each and every staff person in the school influences in one way or another. So we each have power to shape the psychological safety of our teams, our interpersonal relationships and interactions at work, and of our school-wide culture. The other thing to keep in mind is that I have actually seen schools that have a very psychologically unsafe, fear-based administrator, but there are individual teams, and I talk about this in some of the chapters 4 and 5 in the book, where there are individual teams that have high levels of psychological safety, so they sort of become a refuge in what is otherwise a very toxic work environment. So I say that to say that on a very pragmatic level, we all play a role in shaping the psychological safety of our school community, so we can all make a difference. Research on psychological safety in the workplace shows some pretty extraordinary findings. We find that when organizations have higher levels of psychological safety, the individuals who work in those organizations tend to engage in deeper levels, tend to participate and be more productive, and actually have higher levels of job satisfaction, so they enjoy their work more. They also have lower levels of burnout and emotional exhaustion. Something we find in studies on psychological safety is that as psychological safety increases, burnout decreases. We also see that individuals who work in psychologically safe work environments tend to be more interested and invested in their own professional learning and growth. When they collaborate with others, there tends to be higher levels of innovation and creative problem solving. And one of the most important things, which we already talked about, is psychological safety has a significant influence on our self and collective efficacy. In fact, one of the things I talk about quite a bit in chapters 1, 2, and 3 is the relationship between psychological safety and collective teacher efficacy. If you're not familiar with collective teacher efficacy, it's our belief and ability to improve student outcomes. And it is a belief that is grounded in a process of continual improvement informed by evidence of impact. We know from things like John Hattie's visible learning research that collective teacher efficacy has the greatest influence on student achievement. And psychological safety is the fuel, is the thing that facilitates the development of collective teacher efficacy and effective collaboration to improve the outcomes for our students, whether that's academically, behaviorally, et cetera. So I'm going to briefly put up a educator psychological safety assessment, which you can find on pages 15 and 16 in chapter 1. And I'm going to put up these statements, and I just want you to reflect for yourself. You don't have to enter anything into the chat. I just want you to quietly reflect. And just on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree, reflect on your school culture as I read through these statements and what feels true for you. And I adapt this assessment, by the way, sometimes to be specific to certain teams or sometimes school-wide. So there's different ways that I modify this assessment. So statement 1, staff members within my school can bring up problems, challenges, and tough issues. So again, just personally, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, where would that fall for you? I feel safe enough to try new strategies within my school. It is difficult to ask other staff members at my school for help. I feel safe expressing my ideas, questions, and concerns at work. None of my colleagues would intentionally undermine my efforts. At my school, my unique skills and talents are recognized, valued, and utilized. Sorry for the typo in that sentence, by the way. My colleagues and I learned from and with one another. If I make a mistake at work, it will likely be held against me. If I share about a success at work, my colleagues will respond positively. Colleagues within my school sometimes reject others for being different from them. So these 10 statements sort of reflect the different stages or levels of psychological safety within a team or an organization. And as I said, sometimes I'll modify these statements to say things like, instead of within my school, I might put something like within my grade level team, or within our leadership team, or within our MTSS team, right? So in other words, you can adapt this assessment to be specific to the different teams you're looking at, or you can look at the assessment as a school-wide reflection of people's individual and collective experiences of psychological safety. Now, when we think about psychological safety, I want to talk about what it's like to work in a psychologically unsafe school or toxic work environment. And then I want want to talk about what it's like to work in a psychologically safe school. So sort of compare and contrast, and also share with you some very inspiring and true stories about schools that I've worked with over the past 3 years where we have done work to shift the culture from psychologically unsafe to psychologically safe. And we've also then seen not only a shift in people's job satisfaction, their sense of trust and belonging at work, but we've also seen improvements in student outcomes as a result of doing this work. So I want to broadly speak about three sort of common characteristics of psychologically unsafe schools that I notice. They tend to have certain things in common. One is and I'll unpack each of these in a little bit greater detail, they tend to have fear-based administrators. They also tend to have a staff that is divided into cliques and has higher levels of workplace bullying. And there might be sort of cliques and then also sort of people that are sort of the lone wolf. In other words, in order to avoid being caught up in the drama, they sort of isolate to protect themselves, which can feel very lonely. And they tend to have higher levels of collective burnout and fatigue. So let me briefly unpack each of these for a moment. Um, when I talk about fear-based leadership, and you can find a whole section on that on pages 45 to 50 in the other teachers, I talk about a leadership style where administrators default to certain fear-based tactics to manage their staff. And those tactics often resemble our responses to stress, those fight, flight, freeze, and fawn behaviors. So what I mean by that is, for example, let's say we have a fear-based administrator or an administrator with a fear-based leadership style that tends to engage more frequently in fight behaviors. So this would be an administrator who engages in a lot of unfair and excessive criticism of staff and teachers, who tends to manage people through threats and intimidation, through micromanagement, by weaponizing walkthroughs and evaluations as ways to retaliate against individuals, and often engages in a lot of favoritism when thinking about different decisions that are made. You might have a leader or an administrator who has a fear-based style that engages in more flight behaviors. These are individuals that are sort of consumed by their own fear and anxiety, and it impacts and influences the ways they accomplish their work and the culture of the school in some ways. So these are administrators that are often caught up in excessive worrying, overthinking, and having difficulty making decisions. They present sort of worst case scenarios to staff. So it's a lot of like that children's story of Chicken. I think it's Chicken Little, where the sky is falling, the sky is falling. So it's a lot of it creates a culture of fear where staff is constantly anticipating the worst case scenario because of the administrator's communication. A lot of and presenting the staff with a lot of awful scenarios that often don't even happen, but as a way to motivate people into action through fear. We can also see just avoidance of conflict and constructive feedback, and an administrator who fluctuates between overwork and procrastination. Fear-based leaders who engage in more freeze behaviors, these tend to be folks who might be physically present at work, but mentally and emotionally they're disengaged. They just seem sort of checked out. These are administrators or principals who sort of hide in their office. They tend to isolate. They tend to avoid others while at work. They are rarely present in classrooms or common areas, and they tend to allow other staff or students to run the school. And lastly, we can see administrators who exhibit more fawn behaviors, and those tend to be folks who are more people-pleasing. So they have a hard time with accountability, with constructive conversations, so they resort to a lot of flattery. They tend to be overly nice. They tend to be easily manipulated. They also tend to make a lot of excuses for staff members rather than holding them accountable. And I really feel sorry for these individuals. I have a lot of empathy for them because they actually tend to overwork themselves. They actually tend to take on too many responsibilities because they have a hard time delegating things to other people and holding those other individuals accountable. So when I see fear-based leadership styles, what I tend to see is if a leader has a fear-based style, they tend to gravitate towards one or two of these sort of common domains of behavior. So they tend to be more oriented towards fight behavior, or maybe flight behavior, or flight and fawn behaviors, but they sort of tend to find themselves characteristically in one area or another. I also share an example in the book of an administrator or principal who engages in a lot of fight behaviors, but then right before the district visits, she engages in a lot of fawn behaviors and sort of love bombs her staff and excessively praises them and like showers them with all this acknowledgement, et cetera. But just right before the principal or I'm sorry, the superintendent or district admin visit, and then it goes back to threats and intimidation and micromanagement. So folks can fluctuate. But generally speaking, this is a way that's been helpful for me to sort of identify and frame some of the unhealthy leadership styles we see in psychologically unsafe schools. Now, another pattern we often see, and this isn't just between administrators, this is across the entire staff and between teachers and can impact paraprofessionals and all staff, are situations like some of the following that I'm about to mention. So I'm going to read off some scenarios, and I just want you to think for yourself, what do these different scenarios have in common, right? A principal routinely singles out a particular teacher with excessively negative and inaccurate evaluations. That's one scenario. A teacher repeatedly ignores and belittles a paraprofessional who works with her students. A group of teachers gossip about and criticize a fellow teacher to the point where that teacher doesn't feel comfortable leaving his classroom during the school day. A general education teacher regularly undermines his colleague, saying that his colleague doesn't work as hard as he does because the colleague is a special education teacher. Two staff members monopolize the conversation at their weekly grade level team meeting. They talk over and on behalf of other members of the team, never allowing anyone else the opportunity to speak. A group of teachers submit false complaints to their district administration in an effort to get their principal fired. By the way, all of these scenarios I had gathered from various interviews I had done. So they're all based on real life situations and scenarios. And they're all examples of workplace bullying. Workplace bullying occurs when an individual or a group of coworkers repeatedly engages in harmful behaviors that are directed towards a colleague or another group of coworkers. Common forms of workplace bullying include patterns of gossip, scapegoating, excessive and unfair criticism, verbal or written humiliation. So this could happen in emails, text messages, conversations, social rejection and exclusion, or undermining and sabotaging someone else's work. Workplace bullying can often escalate into or be accompanied by various forms of harassment or discrimination prohibited by law. The book, The Other Teachers, has only been out for less than 2 months, and I have had people email me and write to me because after reading the book, they realized there was a name for the type of victimization they were experiencing at work. And one of the things I talk about in the book is making sure that you protect yourself, that you document all instances of workplace bullying and or harassment, and you take action to keep yourself safe because you deserve to be treated with respect at work, and people should be held accountable for maintaining their professional conduct and responsibilities. And so that might mean documenting all instances and then taking appropriate action, and it depends. I'm not here to give legal advice. That could be to contact your administrator, could be to contact human resources if your district has that type of staff or department. And in extreme cases, it may be to seek legal representation through a labor relations or employment attorney, or to contact your union or professional association if you have one. But the point is that you deserve to be treated with respect. And it is not right that we work in schools where we excuse harmful, inappropriate harassment and workplace bullying. So that being said, that type of behavior we often tend to see in psychologically unsafe schools. We can also see higher levels of collective burnout and fatigue. So I talk quite a bit, especially if you're familiar with my work, then you've heard me talk about the different phases and stages of burnout. And this comes from the work of Freudenberger and North, who talk about 12 phases or stages of burnout that start with just a desire to do our job well, encountering a need that surpasses our capacity to respond. We get pulled in a million different directions. And we inevitably, in the early phases of burnout, we start to cancel or change plans with family or friends due to our level of exhaustion. We start to skip meals because of work. We start to have an erratic sleep schedule because of work and fatigue and stress. And we often also see as an early stage of burnout changes in movement, not getting enough healthy movement or exercise. Then there's more moderate stages of burnout when it starts to impact our mental health. We tend to experience more negativity bias, more all or nothing thinking, more blame, greater anxiety, and more challenges in our personal and work relationships. And lastly, we can see severe stages of burnout, which includes both mental and physical symptoms, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and even what's sometimes referred to by medical professionals as burnout syndrome. So the chronic headaches, the gastrointestinal issues, the high blood pressure associated with chronic stress and fatigue. In psychologically unsafe schools, we tend to see staff have higher levels of burnout individually, but also collectively. It starts to shape the culture of the school, where you start to have a staff that is reluctant to try new things, that looks for things to fail. You start to see more presenteeism. So staff and colleagues that are there physically, but mentally and emotionally, they're checked out. And they take that stress out on one another through greater inequitable collaboration and workplace bullying and higher levels of chronic absenteeism and staff turnover. So we tend to see in psychologically unsafe schools these three sort of driving factors of fear-based leadership, cliques and workplace bullying, and collective burnout and fatigue. Now, I want to shift the focus to compare and contrast that with what we notice in psychologically safe schools. So in psychologically safe schools, we tend to see leaders who engage in what I call a connected and firm leadership style. In other words, they're able to balance both empathy and accountability. We also tend to see structured collaboration that drives collective efficacy. So what I mean by that is that in psychologically safe schools, it doesn't mean everybody likes one another. That's delusional, right? Not everybody is going to be best friends with everyone. However, in psychologically safe schools, what I have found is that when educators come together to collaborate, there is a structured process that moves them into having productive conversations, to having and addressing challenges where they ask questions, they voice concerns, they try new things, sometimes make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. So they're engaged in a cycle of inquiry, action, and impact that drives their ability to support student outcomes. But that structure is so critical because whenever there's a lack of structure, personalities take over. And so when I'm coaching an administrator, I tell them, listen, if you're focused on psychological safety, you can't make your staff members all like each other. You can't make this person invite this other person to their baby shower or their birthday party, etc. However, part of their professional responsibility is when they come together during a PLC or an MTSS meeting, et cetera, there needs to be a structured process for collaboration that has folks focus on student data, identify growth areas, take specific actions, ideally implementing evidence-based best practices, collecting that evidence of impact, and engaging in that cycle that supports the best interests of our students, but also has them know each other, at least professionally, in a way that is respectful. So the interesting thing about psychologically safe schools is that they're not always comfortable to work in. In other words, you can have some really uncomfortable, growth-producing conversations, but the point is you manage that conflict in a way that's respectful, rather than in a way where people are rolling their eyes at one another or trash talking someone after a meeting or saying things like, oh, you have that problem in your classroom. In other words, we look at our communication agreements and our protocols of collaboration. And lastly, psychologically safe schools tend to have a greater awareness and practice of both self and collective care. One of the things I talk about in the book and that I practice in the work I do as a coach and consultant is I always start with a needs assessment. What does the staff need to feel supported, valued, connected, and inspired? And then gather their input, identify their pain points, and then take action on alleviating that pain and improving the working conditions for the educators who work in that school. And that to me is collective care, and it's an essential component of this work. So I want to briefly discuss um, a case study, a true story of a school I worked with where when I started working with them, they were a very psychologically unsafe school, a sort of a toxic working environment, if you will. And we moved that to shift not only the culture, but also see an improvement in student outcomes by becoming more psychologically safe. And this is work that we did over the course of 1 year, but I had the opportunity to work with this school for 2 years and see them sustain this work in the second year. I changed the name, by the way, of the school to protect its identity. So when I started the work, I did a needs assessment with the staff, and the overwhelming feedback was this school is run by cliques. The principal listens to her best friends, she ignores everybody else. There was a lack of teacher voice and choice in key decisions, and in general, there was a lot of workplace bullying and inequitable collaboration. People felt like their PLCs, their professional learning communities, were a waste of time. They felt like their MTSS or multi-tiered system of support meetings were just venting sessions. Things didn't have any structure, and there were very low levels of collective efficacy. In fact, I gave a collective efficacy assessment, and less than 20% of the staff said they could collaborate effectively with their colleagues and really believed in their impact. So let's talk about some of the things we did. And I go in great detail in this, especially as we get into the chapters 7 and 8, et cetera. But the first thing we did was we restructured the leadership team. So we had representation across grade levels. We even had a paraprofessional added to the leadership team, the school nurse. We wanted true representation of the different stakeholders throughout the campus. We then went through something that I talk about in chapter 8, which is we did a decision map where we identified who makes which decisions and which decisions need to involve more teacher or all staff voice, and how will that input be collected and then inform the decisions that we made. So we brought some structure and created more equity of voice in decision making. I facilitated some PD, some professional development on workplace bullying, ways to identify it and address it, because sometimes you just need to name the elephant in the room. Then we did a psychological safety assessment for each grade level team. And we implemented over the course of year 1 and year 2 new collaboration protocols during PLC and MTSS meetings. We also tiered the different grade level teams based on their level of support. So what we did basically was if a team had a low level of psychological safety, then the instructional specialist would join that team and facilitate their PLCs and MTSS meetings because they were not able to do that on their own. They had the protocol, they had the communication agreements, but they were not adhering to them. So in other words, they needed more support. Whereas there were other teams that had high levels of psychological safety, they didn't need someone to come in and facilitate or co-facilitate their meetings. They were able to adhere to the protocol as it was given to them. Over the course of year 1 and into year 2, what we found that was surprising to me and inspiring was that we went from less than 20% of teachers saying they could collaborate effectively with colleagues when we did that collective efficacy assessment to over 80% saying they could collaborate and believed in their ability to collectively improve student outcomes. We also saw evidence of that with improved student academic outcomes, many students making more than a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time, and a significant reduction in the number of students needing to receive tier 2 and tier 3 behavioral supports and interventions. So we see that direct relationship between psychological safety and collective efficacy. So for the sake of time, I'm going to very briefly talk about some of the stages of psychological safety, and then we'll watch a little video and we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So when we talk about psychological safety, if you look at the book, The Other Teachers, most of the research and the videos and the conversations around psychological safety, if you really want to nerd out, they talk a lot about challenging the status quo and navigating conflicts and taking interpersonal risks. And that's true. But I then read a book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety by Timothy R. Clark that really sort of turned the light bulb on for me, because Timothy R. Clark made this point that was like, you can't challenge the status quo and make sure everybody has a voice in conflict, et cetera, if people don't have a place at the table, if they're not even in the room when the decision's being made, right? So he's like, in order to achieve psychological safety, there's stages to it. And you have to start with what's called inclusion safety, making sure that people on a team or in a staff feel just welcomed, included, just basic respect and professional courtesy. I often tell my schools a simple bite-sized strategy, as silly as this is, start with good morning and thank you. I can't tell you how many times I have talked to teachers that say they feel invisible in their building because when they say good morning or they acknowledge people, people don't even return the greeting. So start with good morning and thank you. Thank you is incredible because we have research that shows gratitude is contagious. It alleviates stress, it improves workplace culture, and that simple, sincere expressions of gratitude, when the person receives that gratitude, they're more likely to pay it forward and express appreciation to other people throughout their day. So gratitude is contagious. Start with good morning and thank you. Notice who you talk to and who you don't. Just start to notice your own communication patterns so that you can be a change agent to create a more inclusive work environment. But then from that, in order to build on that, part of psychological safety is also the ability to try new things, make mistakes, ask for help, give and receive feedback. So in I think it's chapter 4 or 5, I talk about learner safety, which is our ability to learn from and with one another. A simple bite-sized strategy on a team, celebrate small wins. This work that we do in education is difficult. It requires our brain, our heart, our soul, all of our energy. Sometimes we look at student data and we can get depressed, we can get frustrated, we can get cynical, resentful, we can feel defeated. You have to look for the progress, not perfection. Where is their growth? Even if it's one student, even if it's a relationship that's being built, if it's a shift in behavior, if it's a small amount of progress, you have to celebrate the small wins. You can always look at who benefited and who didn't, and you can refine the work, but you've got to celebrate the small wins. Now, part of doing all of this work, learning from each other, investing, it also requires some degree of what we call contributor safety. This means feeling appreciated, feeling acknowledged, feeling valued. And one of the things I talk about both publicly and in the book is being appropriately compensated. I talk about something called the teacher pay penalty, which is how much educators suffer because there's not a single state where when you look at compensation and benefits, educators make as much as other individuals with similar levels of education and professional experience. So part of this is a national public policy issue. Part of it, though, is also just a human being, person to person professional issue in the workplace, which is, do I feel appreciated? Are my skills and talents valued and utilized? So when I talk to administrators, I sort of look at two things here. First of all, administrators, if you are a principal or a leader in your building or school, the way you express appreciation to your staff, even if it's just simple things you say or a little note here and there, they make a big difference. But the other part of that is part of contributor safety is also accountability. People are tired of working in schools where they punish the good, where certain teachers show up, they do what's expected of them, and other colleagues get away with neglecting their professional responsibilities. In other words, two people are supposed to have hallway duty, and one person shows up every day and the other one's making copies. That's not a safe hallway. That's not a safe campus. People are tired of working in schools where they're implementing the curriculum, they're implementing the instructional strategy, and they have a colleague down the hallway who's been given the same worksheets for 30 years and nobody says anything to them. And so I encourage my administrators that part of creating an environment where people feel valued, they feel that contributor safety, part of it's expressing appreciation, but the other part of it is having tough accountability conversations, improvement plans. I'm not a fan of buy-in. I'm a fan of clarity, support, and accountability. Folks need to know what's expected of them. They need support and understanding how to do it. And then there has to be at some point some conversation about accountability so that those staff members who are not fulfilling their professional obligations are held accountable, while those of them who are fulfilling their professional responsibilities are being acknowledged and valued. And lastly, sort of the pinnacle of psychological safety is what we call challenger safety. It's how we handle challenges in a productive manner. And one of the most important things with this is implementing what I call effective collaboration protocols. Now, this can be as simple as one of the protocols I mentioned is the tuning protocol, which you can Google tuning protocol, Edutopia, if you want to read about it, or the school reform initiative that developed it. But this also includes more complex frameworks like PLC Plus or various education or MTSS frameworks, so that when we come together to collaborate, there is a structured protocol. Like, for example, when I go to work with a team around behavioral MTSS, I have different protocols for identifying a common grade level challenge versus talking about an individual student. And those protocols are there because they keep people moving from admiring the problem and getting stuck inventing to actually taking action and then assessing impact and feeling inspired by the difference they make. So there has to be structure to collaboration. In the book, at the end of every chapter, there's a section with toolkits and strategies, and they're broken down based on what we can do individually, what we can do as a team, if we're on a grade level team, a PLC, an MTSS, et cetera, and then also what we can do if we are an administrator or a leader within our school or district. Now, we only have 1 hour together. There's no way I could talk through all these strategies and practices, but I just want you to know that they're there related to each stage of psychological safety. I want to wrap up looking at a video of a team of educators that are collaborating in a learning lab. And what do you notice based on what we talked about that has helped them to have a psychologically safe experience in their learning lab? Because it's very vulnerable. The teacher we're about to watch has people coming in and observing. Now, that could really go sideways. In fact, it could be a mess. It could become incredibly critical. That teacher could leave the meeting crying. I've seen it happen. But instead, what we're about to see is a team that has put a lot of intentional structure and protocols in place so that they have a psychologically safe, collaborative conversation about effective instruction, learning from and with one another.
If we're learning at our highest potential as teachers, it's only going to serve our students. When we learn, they learn. We're a community of learners.
Because we do teacher labs, we are constantly being driven by a desire to grow together, to collaborate, to communicate, and to be self-reflective.
They're actually teaching me things sometimes, so that's when you know you're really engaged.
I want you to call me over. I'll take a look at your work.
When teachers enhance their craft and improve their skills, then students will improve their level of learning and academic achievement. So teacher labs are a way we formally get teachers together to collaborate. Thank you all for being here. Teachers come together, cross-discipline. It's about a 3-hour session around one focus area. This morning we're focusing on student engagement, specifically student talk.
These kids have got to be engaged in meaningful discourse with each other.
It's facilitated by our instructional specialist. She walks them through a protocol that's very defined with the ultimate purpose of teacher growth.
Somebody volunteers to be a host teacher.
Let's think about how we get there.
Valerie's an 8th grade math teacher, and she wants to get some feedback to improve how students communicate when problem solving.
My biggest goal for the year is trying to get that collaborative work, that collaborative problem solving.
We start off by identifying what student engagement looks like, both from the student side and from the teacher side.
Hopefully we hear kids asking each other questions.
That asking for help without having negative feelings towards themselves or that they think their peers are looking at them differently because they didn't know.
After the discussion, the host teacher speaks to the group about what the lesson is going to be about.
So I've given you handouts that the kids will get.
I talked about the goals of the lesson, what I wanted teachers to look for and observe.
Focus in on how they interact with the task, how engaged they are. Hopefully they'll be able to justify why the correct ways are correct.
By setting the stage, it kind of gets us thinking. Teacher Lab is not just for the host. It is really for every teacher that attends.
Estimates for the population of Brazil.
We go to the host teacher's room, they teach the lesson, and as observers, we will be making notes.
Today we're going to look at population change. I want to start off with a video.
We talked about population growth. It's intriguing to students and something that has some real implications.
How could governments estimate year-to-year population changes without making a complete census?
It led into the math very nicely.
198.78. I was looking for keywords like, let me show you, or how can I help you, or can you explain this better?
What'd you add? Oh, you rounded up to 2.07. Yeah.
After the teachers observe the lesson, we come back and Pauline facilitates the post-discussion, asking the host teacher to just quietly listen.
The process is we all go around and share with Valerie what we noticed. It's very celebratory. The first thing that teachers report back on are the wonderful, amazing things that they saw.
I noticed a lot of math vocabulary when I heard them speaking.
There were mistakes, but they talked about them, and I don't think they ever said you were wrong.
So let's move on to questions. Then they ask wonderings.
I wondered, how do we get kids to that level to say, oh, Eli, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. What are you thinking?
The red light strategy, I was just curious what that was.
The host teacher makes notes on all the questions that everybody had, and then they can respond.
We have a lot of great questions. The red light strategy is a strategy I got from a training over the summer.
Everybody walks away with some new knowledge, some new gained perspective. I've made a student engagement teacher lab page. Just identify a strategy or an action that you want to take back to your classroom and employ.
My big takeaway was that students need support learning how to justify their answers, explain their solutions.
It doesn't show you how it works.
And they need some examples for that. Read the solution. Think about if you have any questions before you get started.
We're really asking teachers to step outside of their comfort zone. We are creatures that live behind closed doors.
Record those estimates.
Normally, nobody ever comes in and sees it.
What'd you do for the change of birth?
To experience being in somebody else's classroom, it's really powerful. What I love about Teacher Labs is we've all got something from it. I think that speaks volumes to the work that you do in your classroom. So thank you so much.
So in that, just take a moment and reflect for yourself, what practices did you notice that fostered that psychological safety? Because here we have a very vulnerable experience of being observed as a teacher by your colleagues, but think about all the structures in place within that protocol to help people give positive feedback, to give the teacher some safety about saying what specifically she wanted feedback on, to hear their questions, choose which questions she wanted to respond to. There were a lot of different things in there to help individuals feel psychologically safe, not necessarily comfortable. It's still challenging. It's still productive struggle. But look at how well it went compared to how it could go if that structure wasn't in place, right? It's not as simple as saying, hey, go observe your colleague, right? That can obviously go sideways. So having those protocols in place help to cultivate that psychological safety and that trust among that team. I want to close with a quote from Timothy R. Clark from his book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, who says, ask yourself if you feel included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge the status quo. Finally, ask yourself if you're creating an environment where others can do these 4 things. In the process, look around and see others with respect and fresh amazement. Find deeper communion in your relationships and more happiness and satisfaction in your own life. So I want to leave you today with a challenge, which is based on our conversation and thinking about the different levels of psychological safety, inclusion, learner, contributor, and challenger safety. What is one thing you can do and one thing you will do to create a more psychologically safe school for you and your colleagues?
So thank you so much. And let's get into some of those Q&A questions. So Katie asked, when you suggest documenting instances of gossip or bullying, what do you believe that looks like? And how do you document gossip or subtle bullying?
Well, if you're experiencing a repeated part of workplace bullying, and it's a tricky area because workplace bullying is sort of this gray area legally. Some districts are starting to implement policies to prohibit it. Some states don't have state or federal legislation about workplace bullying. Some do and are developing it. So it's sort of a tricky gray area. That's why I said I'm not providing any legal advice, but in terms of best practice, if you are experiencing repeated, whether it's gossip, scapegoating, exclusion, et cetera, and you're experiencing those things, I do recommend protecting yourself, and having a record of it is important. So what could that look like? Save emails that might have that sort of tone or inappropriate content. Forward a copy of those emails to your personal email as well if you need to. Screenshot any sort of inappropriate workplace bullying related text messages you might receive. If there are conversations that happen that involve some of those inappropriate or workplace bullying behaviors, even if it's something as simple as taking out the notes app on your phone afterwards and putting just like, when did that happen? Who was there? What was said? Where did it happen, etc., so that you have some sort of record so that if you do reach out, whether it's to your union or your administrator or human resources or an attorney, worst case scenario, you have some record, right, of those events and of those communications and situations. So it can look like everything from taking notes to taking screenshots to keeping emails and communications or copies of evaluations if you feel like evaluations have been used as a retaliatory tool. So just that would be my 2 cents on ways to document that.
Yes, definitely establishing that paper trail. And then Lizzie asked, can you provide some more clarity on what a needs assessment would look like?
Yep.
You mentioned this when you were talking about collective care.
So there's a copy of the needs assessment I use on page 36 of the other teachers. So it's in chapter 2. And essentially, I'm looking at 4 domains. What does the staff need to feel more connected, valued, supported, and inspired? I typically give that assessment as an open-ended questions. Things like, what can we do to maintain and build positive relationships with one another, support each other when we're experiencing challenges at work, feel appreciated and valued, both our well-being and our contribution. So I sort of give these open-ended questions anonymously. I gather the feedback from the staff, and then I organize the feedback into important themes. And then I work with the leadership team to develop an action plan based on those themes. Because if you survey folks and you ask them what they need, you better respond. Because if you survey folks and you ask them what they need and then you don't do anything about it, you break trust. So anytime you give a needs assessment, you have to then follow it up with an action plan on what will be done to address those needs. And I tend to, like I said, go based on themes because I'm not trying to identify any individual. I want it to be totally anonymous. But the actual questions that I ask are on page 36.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then Licia just asked, what can I do to be a more welcomed teacher? So they're a first-year teacher. I don't even know some teachers' names, and there are under 40 teachers.
Okay, great. Like I said, I'd start with good morning and thank you. I think that just those simple little acknowledgments in the hallway when we see folks make a big difference. Even if we're shy, it makes a big difference. So I would just start with something really simple. Good morning and thank you. If there's opportunities to express appreciation, people love to feel appreciated. People also love to feel like it matters that they show up at work. So something as simple as how's your day going or sitting with different folks at lunch. So just I would start very simple, just very, very simple.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I think we have one more question from Emily. They just wanted to know how and when you get asked to work with schools and districts. Is it because the situation is so bad that you get pulled in as an expert? It seems it's kind of unheard of where they come from.
So I work as a consultant and coach. People either reach out to me directly through my website, which is teachfortrust.com, or they reach out to Corwin, my publisher, but also the Corwin team can schedule professional development and coaching sessions. And I get called in for a variety of reasons. I work with thousands of educators each year. I work with schools and districts across the US, Canada, and internationally. Hawaii, Alaska, and everywhere in between, rural, suburban, urban districts. And I work with a variety of schools from low performing to high performing. So the reason I get brought in as a coach can be everything from we need help to things are going well, but there's always room for improvement.
All right, thank you so much. And of course, if you didn't have if you did have questions that didn't get answered today, feel free to send those questions to us at info@corwin.com, and we will send those along to Ricky to get answered for you. And thank you again, Ricky, and thank you everyone who's joined us and participated today. It was a great presentation, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Right. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Be well.